Well, again, it's very good to be reassembled with everyone. Thankful for the time of worship that we've been able to go through so far. And now as we enter into our time of the sermon and studying together, we are still going through our study on the ways of the wanderers to try to comprehend and understand why it is that people decide to wander away from the truth, from God, His people, and in understanding why and how this happens, and how it is that we can go about in bringing them back and trying to restore them. But it's not only in comprehending this in others, but it's also to address any of these same things that might be growing inside of us. That possibly we are in a position to where we are considering wandering away. And as we go through this study, we do not need to lose sight that that is a full possibility for everyone that is assembled with us today. So we're going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul has been taking the Corinthian brethren, and us as well as we're going through this study, on a history lesson. And he has been illustrating for them and for us that if we are not wanting to make the same mistakes of the past, then learn your history. Learn from these people what they did, how they fell short, what were the snares, what were the traps that were in their way, and you can be on the lookout for those things where we do not have to relive those things that they went through. We already studied with the Old Testament Israelites and how that through ingratitude, a lack of thankfulness, just simply counting the blessings that they had, and because of that, there's a failure of recognition of everything that God was doing for them. And so even with that, it's not even just a failure of recognition. They knew what God was doing for them. They just were dissatisfied with what God had done. We can fall into that same dilemma to where we start viewing the laws, regulations, the commandments that God has given to us, and start looking at those in a disdainful type of way, a begrudging type of way, instead of actually appreciating what He's doing and what He has done. There was ingratitude, there was insolence, pride, arrogance, haughtiness. That ingratitude and unthankfulness then bled into and produced them to the point where they would speak out against God, to where they would murmur and complain with what He was doing, having a desire to go back into Egypt. Why in the world would you want to go back into slavery, bondage? Well, it's because we're looking at our present situation, and it's difficult, and then we start looking back at what was going on, and we don't look at it in the proper light. And that's why people leave the church and go back out into the world. Well, this church thing, this Christianity thing is difficult. I remember how it was being out in the world. And then you start thinking about it in the wrong way. Oh, I could do this, I could do that, so on and so forth. And yeah, but you were in bondage to sin also. What about all the trouble those activities got you in? Oh, I wasn't thinking about that. Yeah, we seldom do. But in moving on to the next point, that bleeds from those two elements, and that ultimately leads us to the root of the problem. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 7. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That when we are considering the temptations that cause us to want to wander back out into the world, what is at the very heart and seat of that is an individual wanting to be their own God. I know what God says and how it is that I'm supposed to follow Him, but I'm not wanting to do that. I'm wanting to follow what I think, or how I see it, or how I view it. Some of God's people in the Old Testament became idolaters. And Paul is warning the Christians at Corinth not to become idolaters. What do you think the warning is for us today? Not to become idolaters. And from the Old Testament standpoint, with Old Testament Israel, there is a very pointed prohibition on idolatry. A very strict command that you do not do this. And it's one of the 10 Commandments, all the way back in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 2, I am the Lord thy God, which hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. How fitting that God would state it that way, and then you think about what Aaron said when he made the golden calf. Here is the God that brought you out of Egypt. But in the prohibition, in the command, the reason why you're not doing this is because there's the one God that brought you out of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Now there is the connection that we're making in our introduction about what idolatry is. Why would somebody leave the one true God to then serve, and under the Old Testament time frame, it's an image that they're making? God says it's because you hate me. Oh, no. I love God. Well, then do what He says. Why are you seeking some other element, some other thing that you can place in front of you so as to lead you and to guide you? But just as we said, even though they might have created an image, the image is nothing. Who is in control of the image? The one that made it. An idol of stone or wood, it cannot speak, it cannot hear, it cannot see, it cannot move. So it's the one that creates the idol that is control of the idol. They were becoming gods unto themselves. And what's at the heart of that? There's some type of displeasure with the God of heaven. Here we have God prohibiting any attempt to verify God through the senses. Now we can understand that struggle because God cannot be seen, felt, smelt, tasted, all the things that we would normally use to prove that something is there. And how much easier it would be, I say easier, it would be to believe in God if He would just show Himself. But that's not necessary. That's not needed because God had already shown Himself with the 10 plagues. The leading them by a pillar of fire at night, a cloud during the day. The pushing back of the Red Sea so as to lead them across. All of that was a showing of Himself. There's no need to try to build some type of image that you can tangibly have. So with ancient idolatry, and there are some countries, some customs that are still involved in this practice, it was man's feeble attempt to create God in man's own image. A total reverse from the original process. And with idolatry came a heavy price. Idolatry resulted in incredible suffering. Luke 18, and then we're going to look at 2 Kings 17. Or excuse me, Leviticus 18, not Luke. Leviticus 18:21. And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech. With that kind of warning, that this is the kind of thing that idolatry leads into, why would you want to be a part of that? That it would take you into that level of depravity that you would offer your own children by fire to some image that you just made up. And in 2 Kings 17, we read that the children of Israel did not listen to this warning. For they served idols, whereof the Lord said unto them, Ye shall not do this thing. Well, what did they do? You drop down to verse 17. They caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire and used divinations and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Why would you do this? Why would you wander from the God of heaven? Molech lets us do what we want to do. Molech lets us live how we wish to live. But again, not even considering the trouble that you're putting yourself in. That's not really living. But that's what the world thinks. I'm out here, have no restrictions, have no regulations. Yeah, but you've got a world of hurt. Just living in trouble all the time. And you read more of the kings and the kind of problems that they had, not only societal, but even civil. The political corruption that was taking place is because they left God and they went to serve idols. But going back to 1 Kings, so that's 2 Kings 17, going back to 1 Kings 11. We can read about just how deceptive the worshiping of idols and allowing idols to come in actually is. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, a Gentile idol, the abomination of Moab in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. One of the very gods listed in Leviticus. You do not serve this. You do not worship after this. And here's the wisest man to live at this time. And look at what he's doing. In which we know the reason why he was led to wander away is because of his strange wives. Evil communications corrupt good morals or good manners. Who you end up binding yourself close to will end up having an evil influence on you. If it could happen to Israel coming out of Egypt, and in that you have Aaron, the brother of Moses, and he got wrapped up in this. Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, and he is wrapped up in this. Then what about us? But as we've said, we're not needing to get caught up on the image of it. None of us, I'm sure, will ever have any type of wooden, golden, silver image in our homes where we'll bow down and worship it. It's not about the image, it's about self. You end up being the God. Now, just as we're considering this, we want to think about, what about modern day idolatry? A lot of the times, when going through studies like this, it's connected to greed, materialism, the chasing after those things, and that those things become our gods. In which there is some connection to that with what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. That he wrote to those brethren, those Christians, mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanliness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. For which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience. God's word is plain and pointed once again. Idolatry is not to be accepted, is not to be allowed. But with this, we have some further clarification and definition as to what idolatry is. Idolatry is simply covetousness. And when it comes to covetousness, that goes beyond just money or materialism. Anything that I would covet and that the God of heaven says that I cannot have, but then I go after that thing anyways because of my own desires, who has just become God? I have. In viewing that aspect of modern idolatry, people oftentimes get valued by their salary, by their manner or standard of living. Expensive clothes, flashy cars, elaborate homes, the stocks that, mutual funds that you'd have in your portfolio. When people should really be valued by their personal integrity, by their character. The word covetousness has the definition of a defrauder. And a defrauder, through greedy, or somebody who's greedy of gain. But all of those things that we just listed, the material things, have their connection in something else. Now, there are some people that just like those things. And that's just, I've got to have it, got to have it, got to have it. The more I have, the better that it is. But some people covet those things for another reason. They're actually not covetous of the things. They're covetous of what James writes about, that those things can actually bring. James chapter 2 and verse 1, my brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect to persons. For if there come unto your assembly a man with a gold ring in goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and say unto him, sit thou here in a good place, and say to the poor, stand thou there, or sit here under my footstool. Some people use those elements as a stepping stone because they're covetous of influence. They're covetous of power, respect. And they're going the wrong way so as to achieve it, so as to receive it. And thus they end up ignoring the ways in which God says, hey, here is how you receive the respect and the appreciation, the admiration of the brethren. It's not by the things that you have, but it's by how you serve. Not how you serve yourself, it's how you serve others. And in that category is where the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees would fit into how they were idolatrous. They had set aside the commandments of God and established their own form of teaching and doctrine. For what purpose? They wanted to be in control. They wanted power. They wanted to be seen of men. That's what they were covetous over. That's idolatry. And they were so greedy for that that they defrauded the people. And that's very literal. They devoured widows' houses, charging interest on the poor that were coming to buy sacrifices at the temple. That's idolatry. Well, where's the idol? We're in the temple. We have no graven image. You are the graven image. So as we are viewing this and we're thinking about the ways of the wanderers, all of this comes back to the battling of self. Why would I be unthankful? Well, that's selfishness. I'm not getting my way. I'm not getting what I would want. The children of Israel, we remember in Egypt the fish, the leeks, and all these different things. And we loathe this bread. That's selfish. Be satisfied with what He's given. Give thanks. And then why would they complain? Selfishness. And it all stems from idolatry. So when we're thinking about these elements, and though they are separated and working apart from one another, all these things are connected. That it's not a situation of, well, okay, here's a person and now they're being covetous, and now here's something different with the same person and now they're being ingrates. No, they can all be together at the same time. Because it's symptoms of the same problem. They will not set aside their own will for the will of God. And they wander out. But just as with the Old Testament idolatry, and that even that worship of a false god required sacrifices, modern idolatry has modern sacrifices. We read 2 Kings 17, they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire. Idolatry has a cost. Sin has a cost. In the Old Testament, they were sacrificing their children. But even as we're thinking about modern idolatry today, the sacrifice is still the same. Those things that were happening under the Old Testament system were not just elements that were hurting the parents, but those things had an effect on the children. And modern idolatry today, which is covetousness, also ends up having an effect on our young people. Now, when we think about those consequences of the Old Testament sacrifices, contrasted to the sacrifices of modern idolatry today, the fires of Molech would be preferred. Because at least that pain would be for a moment. But the effects of modern idolatrous sacrifices, that pain can last a lifetime. When battling these elements of the material world, and that children end up being sacrificed because of the selfishness of parents. Parents that are too determined to have more and more material things. And then what ends up happening to the children because of that? Because the parents want to live outside of their means and is outside of their comfort zone, the children are packed away to babysitters and daycares. And the children end up being helpless in this. In the mad craze for material things. And for those elements of life. Homes are broken. And throughout all of it, the children are just confused. And this finds its connection back in our Matthew study when we're talking about in Matthew chapter 19 and we're dealing with the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And we made the point on how that when we're talking about this topic, oftentimes we want to talk about what happens to the husband and wife in the scenario, and we raise the question about who gets overlooked in that. What about the children? And the effect that's going to be had on them if you decide to go through with this. Well, why aren't mom and dad getting along? Why is our family breaking up? And we made the point about how oftentimes with children, they end up asking the question, is it my fault? And just as we said, in these type of ways, in these elements, modern idolatry is more vicious. The fires of Molech would last for a few moments and then the pain is gone. But with modern idolatry, the wounds that the children have are for life. So this is serious stuff. These are serious matters. And that as we, as adults and parents, as we start making decisions of what we're going to do, and the paths that we're going to take, these kind of elements need to be taken into view and into the picture. What kind of sacrifice? What is this going to cost? And we can go on and on with the list of things on how it's easy to be caught up by idolatry today. Chasing after the almighty dollar, the desire to build a business, to build a career, even trying to acquire education. All of those things can end up being elements of idolatry in our lives that would end up running us instead of us controlling it. And even when we're considering parents that do not balance out the desires of their children, that parents end up allowing, and this is becoming more and more prevalent and a problem inside the Lord's church, that parents allow sports for their children to become an idol. that I have known of parents that will bus their kids all over the state just to play soccer. They sacrifice time, sleep, money, all of that stuff so that their kid can go kick a ball around a field. But then what about when it comes to doing things with the church? There's not the same effort. See, they're not interested in serving that God. They'd rather serve the God on the soccer field. Which again ultimately boils down to the self. Find itself in other forms of entertainment, recreation, all of that. And even with some parents, they're trying to live through their children in sports. So even then, it's not even really a problem with the child. It still goes back to the parent. Either because of something they weren't able to do as they were a kid, and now it's like, well, I'm trying to live through that with my child. That's idolatry. Serving of self. How I feel, how I think, what I want. And a person chases after those desires and those things to wander away from God. As Christians, we are called to make a sacrifice. Romans 12, verse 1, Paul wrote to those brethren, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. If we are wanting to sacrifice something, that is what we need to sacrifice. Ourselves, not somebody else. Jesus said in Matthew 16, if you're not going to carry your cross so as to follow Him, you're not worthy of Him. And if we are willing to sacrifice self, then the desire to wander out into the world is going to be controlled. And that is the battle we are facing every day. Well, I'm in this situation and this is how I want to behave. This is how I want to react. This is how I want to be. But I know what God says about it. And if my thinking is not correct, I can complain about what God's way says to be. I can be dissatisfied with what He says that I'm supposed to do. And then I just go ahead and do what I want to do. That's idolatry. That's covetousness. With the things that we listed, when one or more of these things pertaining to life on this earth become so important or become more important than the spiritual values and practices of what God has commanded, we're making a sacrifice. But it's not a good one. But when we're considering what comes with the sacrifices that we make as Christians, and we start contrasting the value from those sacrifices to the values of what we would supposedly gain with the world. Psalm 51, beginning in verse 7, gives us a glimpse of what it is that we're able to gain, what is in store for us, if we will make that living sacrifice that God requires. The psalmist writes, purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. There's a cleansing from sin that comes with this. Make me to hear joy and gladness. That's what you stand to gain by submitting to God, but it's also what you stand to lose if you're going to wander off in idolatry. That the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. That's a picture of that clean conscience, that good conscience that Peter would write about. Cast me not away from thy presence. To follow after God is to stay in His presence, to have His face look upon us. And to wander is to go away from that. And take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. To have that guidance and that direction that God offers through His truth, through His inspired word. And that for us to wander away from all of that is, as is pictured in the Psalms, to stumble about as a blind man. Just consider that, how terrifying that would be if tomorrow you were to wake up and your sight was gone. And to have that happen spiritually for what? Momentary pleasure of earth? Momentary pleasure of sin, going against what God says for my own will, my own satisfaction? That's idolatry. That even as Jesus would say in Matthew 13:44, what is it that we gain? Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in the field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof he goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. That this is what Christ was willing to sacrifice for us so as to gain us. And why? Because we're precious in His sight. Why would you wander away from that? Why would you walk away from that to be a part of the world? You're just not thinking. You're not thinking and not thinking clearly. The picture that's presented for us of what is in the kingdom: joy, peace, hope, love, honor, there's provision, there's safety, there's mercy. And that all of those good things would be sacrificed for the things that are temporary. Everything that's here has the same destination. It's going to waste away. It's going to rust. It's going to decay. Even these bodies that we are in are a constant reminder of that fact. Every day we're getting older, and every day something new hurts. Because we're breaking down. This is not lasting forever. So what should I focus on? What's eternal? To not know history is destiny to become idolatrous. And we live in a world where a host of people that would claim to be Christians, claim to be religious, claim to be following God, following God, but you look at their lives and you can tell who they're really following. In the United States, we do not have images. We do not have idols of gold and silver, wood and stone. We have idols of flesh and blood. That, as Paul wrote of the Gentiles in Romans chapter 1, they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. So what happened? They became God. They no longer worship the Creator. They worship the creature. They worship themselves. And this idolatry opens the door to other immoralities. Going back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we read verse 7 of how it is that Paul says, "Neither be idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." Verse 8 then says, "Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed and fell in one day, 23,000. This ingratitude, this insolence, which is rooted in idolatry, it led them to fornication. Well, here's what this God says about fornication, but hey, I've created this other God. It says fornication is fine. And the punishment for that was 23,000 died in one day. Now just think about all the things we listed before. Desire for career, money, material things. How many spouses are drawn into adultery? Chasing a career. Chasing a career and the dollar. They're not at home. They're over here all the time with this group of people. And they're led off into it. Now, even with that, it can go a bit deeper with some people. How many husbands get drawn off into adultery to feel powerful? How many women end up throwing themselves at men because they are powerful, in a position of leadership, in a position of authority? And then looking at the sacrifice of the children in those different elements because of these problems with the parents. The kinds of things that children learn from being around the babysitter. The kind of things that children learn when they're at daycare. Because what are the parents doing? It's under the claim of, we're trying to make a living, but it's, no, your living has been met. Now you're just going after something extra. Not content with what you have. Got to have more. And that breakdown of the home that ends up taking place because of selfish desires. And even going to the sports aspect of it, just the kind of things that kids are going to learn, not just from their teammates, but from the coaches. Had a preaching friend in the past, and he would use this illustration a lot in his sermons, but it's a good one and it fits to a lot of the points. He didn't learn his first curse word until he started playing pee-wee football. Worldly influence. So it's not a situation that, oh, well, Pee-wee football is sinful. It goes back to, who are you allowing your children to spend time with? While you're busy out here doing something else. All of these things are needed to be taken into consideration. And that these individuals are drawn like a moth to a flame through their own covetousness. And we wander away from God. In bringing this section of the wanderer study to a conclusion, we're going to move on from 1 Corinthians 10. And next week we're still going to look at an Old Testament study. We're still going to be studying from the past, but we're going to be studying from Jeremiah. God's people have always had their relationship with God challenged. And we've studied that His people in the past, in history, the Old Testament, oftentimes they were brought under the influence of idolatry, immorality, insolence, and ingratitude. So typical of a generation that neither knew God or loved God. And that with those temptations and succumbing to them, many of God's people fell. As the record tells us, 23,000 in one day. But all of God's people did not rebel. Joshua and Caleb were the only two of that generation to make it into the Promised Land. So as the world around us oftentimes wants to throw that in our face of, well, how can you condemn an entire world to be lost? And that this little tiny group is going to be the only ones with a chance to make it to heaven. You need to study your history. Because at this time, when these people were not allowed to go into the Promised Land, there were millions of Israelites. And that's not even including the Egyptians that came with them. And out of all those millions of people, only 2 made it into the Promised Land. Failure is a bitter experience. And even for the Israelites, in that occasion, it was a failure. I'm sure there were a lot of sad funerals in those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And that how terrible it was to go all that time and then they did not get to see the Promised Land. And there was nothing pretty about God's people losing faith. But their failure was not defeat. They had forfeited their right to enter into the Promised Land. But they still had a chance to go to heaven. And that's the point of failure not being defeat. Yes, they fell short. Yes, they sinned against God. But they did not sit down and wallow in it. They got up and kept on going. And even to the degree where the leader, Moses, did not get to go into the Promised Land. Even the leader suffered failure, but he wasn't defeated. Even he rebelled against God, sinned against God, but we find him on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17. We had better be students of history and learn these lessons well. But not only learning their lessons, but learning our own. As we go through trial, and as we find ourselves in positions of temptation, that okay, we're going to be overcome. We're going to fall short. Yeah, that's a failure. The test came and you failed. But that does not mean it's a defeat. It doesn't mean that you've lost. Acknowledge it, learn from it, get back up and go. We do not need to vainly imagine that unfaithfulness cannot happen to us. Remember Israel of old. And then with that acknowledgement and that realization, then renew our souls to strive to live a Christian life. And that requires faithfulness. And as we've mentioned previously with these studies, it's designed to help those that will be watching these sermons later to realize you're going to sin, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to fall short. And maybe even go so far as to turn your back on God, turn your back on His people, and go back out into the world. Okay, you've fallen, you failed, but it's not defeat. These things don't just happen. There are reasons behind it. There are elements behind it. And these elements can be fixed. They can be worked with. And that this should bring about a sense of comfort in being a Christian. Well, what's going to be the reaction if I sin? Nobody's going to be surprised. Nobody's going to wag the finger. Nobody's going to say, how could you? It's, let's analyze this and let's figure out what's going on. And let's fix it. And let's just go on. And that is what Christ was offering with His death on the cross, is reconciliation. People that have been separated from God to be reconciled to Him. Brought back. Bound back. And if that's what's possible in becoming a Christian for the first time, then what is possible when we are a Christian now and we wander away? Reconciliation. That's the aim of these studies. That's the goal of these studies, is to be able to understand. Why does this happen? What can we do about it? And so with that, in our conclusion, we offer the Lord's invitation. For those of us here that are members of the Lord's church, and in realizing together, being a Christian is a struggle. It has its ups, but it also has its downs. and that we are here for all of it. We're not just here for the ups, we're here for the downs also. So if any are in need of prayers of encouragement and strengthening, then we offer that as we stand and as we sing together.